So, good morning, Professor Jonathan Rigg, and good afternoon for everyone in Thailand. Now it's at 25 now. So thank you for joining us in this evening. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Kampanat Piyatamlongchai. I'm from Naresuan University. So I would like to welcome all of you to the 6th session of Virtual Geography Speaker Series that hosted and organized by University of Wisconsin-Madison, Chulalongkorn University, Chiang Mai University, and Naresuan University, and also the Geographical Association of Thailand. So let me tell some about the presentation here. During the presentation, if anyone had any question, you can leave the message in the chat box in the Zoom here. So otherwise, if you want to ask the question, you can also ask the question live after the presentation finished. So I think it's time. I would like to introduce Dr. Puttaporn, who will be the moderator this evening event. So she is a lecturer in the Department of Geography at Chulalongkorn University. Her research relates on the political geography, cultural geography, and migrant workers. So let me give the Zoom seminar here to Dr. Puttaporn. So she will be the moderator. So please welcome and thank you very much, everyone.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, Jonathan. So I'll be the moderator today. I will introduce our speaker in English and also in Thai. Today, we are honored by Professor Jonathan Rigg, and can I call you Ajahn Jonathan? Ajahn Jonathan is chair in Human Geography, School of Geographical Sciences, University of Bristol. His research focuses on human transformation, migration, mobility, and rural development, specifically in Southeast Asia. Ajahn Jonathan have done many research on Thai society, including the research that he will talk and focus today. Why do smallholder farmers persist in Southeast Asia? Perspectives from Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. ทำไมเกษตรกรรายย่อยจึงไม่หายไปจากเอเชียตะวันออกเฉียงใต้มุมมองจากลาวไทยและเวียดนาม Therefore, I think this is a great opportunity to learn from his experience. The talk will run around 50 minutes and followed by 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. Also, if you have any question during the talk, feel free to type the question in the chat anytime. And even though the talk would be in English, but feel free to ask in Thai. I will help translate into English. Also, Ajahn Jonathan can listen and speak Thai a little bit too. So วันนี้เราได้รับเกียรติจากอาจารย์โจนาธานเป็นสปีกเกอร์ของเรานะคะโดยอาจารย์โจนาธานมีความเชี่ยวชาญในด้านของการย้ายถิ่นการเคลื่อนย้ายการพัฒนาในชนบทโดยเฉพาะอย่างยิ่งในบริบทของเอเชียตะวันออกเฉียงใต้รวมถึงประเทศไทยด้วยและงานที่อาจารย์จะพูดถึงในวันนี้ก็เกี่ยวข้องกับประเทศไทยเช่นเดียวกันนะคะเรื่องเกี่ยวกับทำไมเกษตรกรรายย่อยยังคงอยู่ในเอเชียตะวันออกเฉียงใต้มุมมองจากลาวไทยและเวียดนามดังนั้นทางเราเลยคิดว่านี่น่าจะเป็นโอกาสที่ดีที่จะได้เรียนรู้จากประสบการณ์ของอาจารย์งานเสวนานี้จะใช้เวลาประมาณ50นาทีแล้วก็ตามด้วยถามตอบอีก 20-30 นาทีนะคะถ้าหากท่านใดมีคำถามในระหว่างการนำเสนอสามารถพิมพ์คำถามเข้ามาได้ทั้งภาษาไทยแล้วก็ภาษาอังกฤษนะคะอาจารย์โจนาธานสามารถพูดแล้วก็ฟังไทยได้นิดหน่อยแล้วก็ดิฉันจะเป็นคนช่วยแปลให้ด้วยค่ะ Now I will give this stage to Ajahn Jonathan. Ajahn Jonathan, please.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ajahn Puttaporn. That was an excellent introduction. Okay, it's a real pleasure to be able to present to you. It's a beautiful morning here in Bristol at 9 o'clock, and I'm sure you're getting to the end of the day in Thailand. I've got to say, I haven't visited Asia for more than 2 years now. I'm hoping to come to Chula and Thailand in May, but it's been a long time, so I feel oddly disconnected from things in Asia, but I'm hoping to put that right soon. This talk today, and I've got quite a few slides, but I will keep it to 45 minutes, 50 minutes. I'll aim to finish around about 9:50 UK time. So sort of before, is it about 4 o'clock in Thailand at the moment? I guess so. Anyway, it's got a long history, this talk, and in a sense goes right back to when I did my PhD in Mahasarakam in 1982. And I'll try and pick out that history as I go through things. Right, let's see if I can get. Okay, I want to start with, I want to kind of, I suppose, situate the Asian experience in wider context. So I want to start by discussing some of the theoretical background to the issues that I'm going to raise later. So first of all, I'm interested in sort of what happens to land, and in particular to smallholders, over the course of the agrarian transition, and more broadly over the course of economic transformation. And if you look across Asia, and I mean not just Thailand and Southeast Asia, I mean East and Southeast and South Asia as well, you'll see that from the 1960s through to the 2000s, actually the size of land holdings has remained remarkably constant. If anything, it's declined across most of the countries that I've worked in and that interest me. And although that seems very normal, I think, to people who work in Asia, if you place that in broader context, it's really quite a surprise. So why have smallholders persisted across Thailand, Southeast Asia, East and South Asia? And that's the puzzle which I want to talk about this afternoon with you. The reason why it's a puzzle is because the experience of Western Europe and the US, and of course there's no reason why Asia should sort of follow the experience of the US and Europe, but the experience of those places is that over development time, small holdings gradually disappear and they amalgamate into larger units of production. And this graph here shows that for the US. And you can see that from the middle of the 19th century, so around about 1850, 1860, through to 2015, you see, you see first of all, the size of land holdings, and this is the orange line here, really remaining quite stable from around about 1860 through to about 1940 at about 150 acres per holding. And then from then on, you see a dramatic increase in the size of land holdings and a corresponding fall in the number of holdings. This is called the law of the farm size transition. And essentially, the argument is that as per capita income rises, as economies diversify and workers leave agriculture, so you will see this naturally occurring. Smallholders selling their land, and if you like, you'll see a transition from farming as a way of life into farming as a business. And you can also see that in the work of Engels, Karl Kautsky, and so forth, in terms of their work on the agrarian transition, that the smallholder, if you like, the peasant cultivator, is doomed in the context both of sort of capitalist transition and, for that matter, socialist transition. So there's a kind of bigger story here, which is about the amalgamation of small holding into larger units of production. And that means, of course, that those figures that I showed at the start are surprising, because we know that South, Southeast and East Asia have gone through extraordinary transformation, and yet their small holdings seem to stubbornly persist. Now the question for me is why? So let's sort of continue for a few minutes. This is a graph I put together a couple of years ago, and on the x-axis I have average farm size, on the y-axis I have GDP per capita. And what you can see here is that there does indeed seem to be a clear link between economic growth, or if you like, prosperity measured in terms of GDP per capita, and average farm size, that there seems to be a positive relationship between the two, that as countries get richer, farms get bigger, essentially. But what if we pick out the Asian countries in this graph? And that's what I've done here. So the red dots are East Asia, so China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. The yellow dots are South Asia, so Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so on. And the green dots are Southeast Asia. And you can see that for the Asian countries, so that part of the world that I'm most interested in, actually no country has an average farm size of larger than 3.2 hectares. So although the kind of global story from the graph may be one of farm size transition, if we pick out Asia as, if you like, the part of the world that we're interested in, that doesn't hold credence. And now, I mean, imagine, I can see most of you are obviously in Thailand. If we just pick out Thailand, there's Thailand there in the middle of the graph. And if we track the size of land holdings over time for Thailand, this is what it looks like. So going back to the 1960 census, 78, 80, 1993, 2003, and 2013, you can see that over that time, Thailand has moved up the wealth scale, obviously making the transformation from a low income to a middle income to an upper middle income country. And yet, over the course of that quite extraordinary expensive transformation, small holdings, you know, if you have the size of small holding or the average size of holdings remaining remarkably stable. And so we've got two stories here. We've got, if you like, the US story, farm size transition, the law of the farm size transition, one which appear to be opting, if anything, in the other direction, that small holdings are getting smaller and more numerous, whereas in the US they're getting bigger and less numerous. And it's that which I want to sort of explore this afternoon with you. So I've just got some figures. I did a photo that was taken in Flores in Indonesia with one of my PhD students, where you can see 2018, so 4 years ago now. And I've just got a few figures here to put, I suppose, to say why this is an important question. There are around about 600 million farms across the world, and around about 500 million of those, around about 85%, are small farms, so less than 2 hectares. There are about another 10% that are sized between 2 and 5 hectares. So we've got getting on, I mean, over 90% of farms across the world are smaller than 5 hectares in extent. And most of those in Asia. And if we take, for the sake of argument, that maybe an average size of household is about 4, we're talking about 2 billion, 2.5 billion people. So this is no kind of small question to ask. We're talking about many hundreds of millions of farms and billions of people. So this question of why does holders persist, and I suppose also should we be concerned about it, and I'll come on to that in just a moment, is important. And the final point I've got here is that if we're interested in reducing poverty and understanding poverty, then we need to pay attention to the smallholder, because most of the world's poor are smallholder farmers. Okay, so that's the kind of big picture which sits behind my talk this afternoon. Now, just to focus on Thailand for a moment. This is the village where I did my PhD back in 1982. God, my goodness, that's a long time ago, isn't it? And here is the same village in 1994, and here it is in 2008. So it, like the country as a whole, and I could produce the same pictures for Vietnam, for, I mean, to some extent for Laos as well, but I've got them here for Thailand. These pictures tell a story of extraordinary change across rural Thailand, which I think makes it even more surprising that, I suppose, behind this image of change is also a story of persistence, which is the one that I'm focusing on. And just to kind of emphasize this point about change even more, I mean, as again, these are figures for Thailand. Agriculture as a share of GDP has gone from close to 1/2 to about about 10%. Poverty, of course, has declined to less than 10%. Agriculture's share of employment has gone from 82 to 33%, share of exports from 90 to 20%, and the rural population from 80% to 50%. So a compelling story of change in Thailand, and that's reflected in this graph here. So it does seem on the face of it that the law of the farm size transition should apply to Thailand. All of the pieces of the puzzle, if you like. So I've got this quote here again from Hazel and Rahman, who are trying to explain the law of the farm size transition. All of the things that they highlight, per capita increases in income, diversification in the economy, migration of workers out of farming and into non-farm activities, rural-urban migration, all of those things are there, and yet the farm size transition does not appear to follow. Last thing to say before I get on to the reasons why I think, well, I suppose before I get on to trying to answer that question, is to make the point that for many, I think for many sort of government officials, politicians, and for some academics, the persistence of the smallholder is not just an academic conundrum, it's also a problem. It's something that requires addressing through policy. And I just want to sort of explore that for a moment, because I think it's really important to remember that this is not just, if you like, an academic question, one that's linked to a theoretical assumption about the historical process of change. It's also tied very firmly into a set of applied questions about maintaining the vitality of the rural economy, and in particular agriculture. So I've got three quotes here, one from prominent sort of Japanese agricultural economist Otsuka. Says this study strongly argues that unless drastic policy measures are taken to expand farm size, Asia as a whole is likely to lose comparative advantage in agriculture. So the feeling there, what behind that quote, is that smallholders are inefficient, and that if we want to create a modern, efficient agricultural sector, we need to do something about it. Then I have a quote for Thailand. The rice farming sector in Thailand needs a transformation that turns small-scale farmers into large-scale farm operators to ensure productivity and profitability. So the same point that Otsuka is making here with reference to Thailand. And then for Malaysia, the overriding issue in our agricultural sector is the predominance of small-scale farmers. And in that is the view that that is something that needs to be, if you like, put right. And I think it's just worth sort of reflecting on why scholars and policymakers see the persistence of smallholders, peasant farmers or quasi-peasant farmers as a problem. I think the first reason is it's used to explain why rural poverty is also so persistent. That because smallholder farming is inefficient and unproductive, it tends to perpetuate poverty in the rural context. So if we want to address rural poverty, we need to address the smallholder problem. Secondly, and maybe this is particularly apposite in the context of Ukraine and the question about global food supplies, with the great sort of UPOMs maybe being out of out of production. There's a point that if smallholders persist, will countries be able to feed their populations? I mean, maybe that's not a particular question for Thailand, but it is for many other countries. So if national food security and maybe global food security is a question that we are interested in, then that's a second reason why perhaps smallholder persistence needs to be addressed. And thirdly, that it stifles national development, that smallholders need reintegrated into the modern economy. We need to, if you like, drag particularly young rural smallholders out of that context and put them into high return activities, whether in the farm or non-farm sector. So those are the reasons I think that sit behind this problematization of the smallholder. Okay, so now I'm moving on to, if you like, answer my question. I mean, having said I'll answer my question, I'm not sure if I will answer my question, but I'll propose a set of reasons why the smallholders. I'll be very interested to see what those on this seminar think, and maybe hear their views, your views. So I've got 6 reasons that I want to run through. I've got questions of political economy, agroecology, culture. I've got a historical perspective I want to explore, a livelihoods angle, which I'll spend probably the most time on, and also a set of methodological issues, which I think are important. And I'll sort of run through each of these in turn, explaining why they could be reasons, and to some extent then saying why I think they probably don't apply. But anyway, I'll run through them. And I mean, truly, my mind is open as to why smallholders persist. So first of all, political economy. So this is a graph showing, as you can see, nominal rates of assistance to agriculture in Southeast Asia and Thailand. So I picked out the Thailand figures, which are blue, and for Southeast Asia as a whole in orange. And this, in a sense, is a measure of urban bias or rural bias in policy. If the bars are above the line, if you like, above the axis, then it's a rural bias, and if they're below, it's an urban bias. And you can see that for a large part of the period from 1970 through to the turn of the millennium, for Southeast Asia and for Thailand, there was a, if you like, an urban bias in policy making. So governments were extracting value from agriculture to support urban populations and industrialities. So there's a sort of classic Michael Lipton sort of urban bias perspective. It didn't apply, though, equally across all countries. If you look at different parts of Asia, you'll see different, I mean, unsurprisingly, different levels of urban and rural bias. So we picked 2 out here. You can see Malaysia has had a rural bias for quite a long time. That's, I think you could argue, been driven by politics, the importance of the Malay population, mainly rural, as opposed to the sort of Chinese Malaysian population who are mainly urban. So there's a real kind of, if you like, sort of I think political explanation behind that. But you see in Malaysia a rural bias over the period from 1980 to 2005. And then we look at China and Thailand, and we see that's the case. We could look at the way in which governments have shaped policies and support mechanisms and taxation regimes, either to support agriculture and rural living, or alternatively to tax agriculture and rural living. And depending where we look across Asia, we see slightly different stories emerging. We've been doing some work in Vietnam recently, and something I've been interested there in is the degree to which farming is profitable. A little bit like sort of Thailand, you do see small holdings persist. And what comes through in the work that we've been doing in the Red River Delta is how, from an economic point of view, how unattractive rice agriculture is. And I've got 3 quotes here which illustrate that. So the top one, although we still keep growing rice, we do not spend much time and concern for growing. We earn much more money from other jobs rather than spending time rice growing. So economically, it seems as though rice cultivation is an increasingly marginal activity. And I think that's a story that resonates across the Asian context. And even in countries where there's been a rural bias, like Malaysia, often the returns to agriculture are being squeezed over time. For Vietnam, there's also another angle to the political economy of agriculture, which is that the state has a fairly firm control over what is planted where. And the work that we've been doing, as say in these communes in the Red River Delta, show that for some farmers, they have no choice but to grow rice. So they can't plant alternative crops. So the commune authorities insist that rice continues to be grown. And that comes back to that earlier point about the need to meet kind of domestic food production needs. So to meet the needs of food security at the national level. It wasn't very long ago that Vietnam faced famine conditions. So at the end of the 70s, early 80s. And there's that sense that we can't have that happen again. So the state also imposes certain rules and regulations on what can be planted where. And the final slide on this is from a table, a sort of paper I was involved in writing, came out in 2020. And what I'm just picking out here is the net profit from owning 3 sao of rice land. And you can see that essentially the net profit is about almost 3 million Vietnam dong, and that's about 136 US dollars. That's about a fortnight's work for an average worker in Vietnam, at least the people we were interviewing. So I think that gives a flavor of how little return there is from rice farming here in North Vietnam. So the second explanation that you'll occasionally see in the literature is that, if you like, an agroecological explanation, particularly for wet rice. So the argument is that essentially wet rice cultivation is not amenable to upscaling. So, you know, having farms hundreds of acres large, you just can't do it with wet rice. If you like, the fragmentation of the landscape into tiny plots of land, the way in which those are farmed tends to work against the logics of the farm size transition. And this is something that the scholar Francesca Bray has made several times. And I've got a quote here from her 1986 book, The Rice Economies, Technology and Development in Asian Societies. Wet rice cultivation shapes and divides a landscape decisively. Fields which are undrained and permanently waterlogged are suitable for very few other crops. So there's that sense that there's a set of agroecological reasons, if you like, landscape-based reasons, which prevent the farm size transition occurring. And this is some work that we were doing with Khon Kaen University a few years ago, where we were mapping out land, its ownership. And I suppose what you can see here is the extraordinary complexity of the farmed landscape in a rain-fed rice growing area outside Khon Kaen. Yeah, so, and upscaling this sort of farming system into large farms of even scores of hectares is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. So maybe there is some sort of physical constraints to the process that I outlined at the beginning. And I've also got to say that, I mean, thinking back to my PhD, this is a photo I took in 1982 in Mahasarikam. I was really struck at that time by the way in which farmers were juggling risk and reward across different agroecological niches, having, if you like, upper paddy land, middle paddy land, lower paddy land, planting different rice varieties on different pieces of land. And that complexity I found at the time almost working against the logics of large-scale mechanized agriculture. Right, third set of reasons are what I call them cultural. This sort of sense that rice is more than a crop. It's more than, it's not a business. It's a way of life. It's kind of embedded deeply within the Asian psyche. It has value that goes beyond its economic value and its nutritional value. And the idea that we can treat rice cultivation as just another crop, conducive to kind of upscaling, to mechanization, to commoditization, just does not hold true. And I think scholars historically have been very, and particularly anthropologists, and I've got a quote here from Michael Merman's classic study of Northern Thailand in 1968, this sense that, you know, rice is just so important that you don't mess with it. And maybe there are cultural impediments to the sort of farm size transition that I talked about earlier. So it's not just political economy and the relative prices of different types of work. It's not just agroecology. So the physical, the landscape constraints that exist, but there's also a cultural story here that we need to tell. This slide, picture I took in Laos. We're working in Luang Prabang, and the farmer we were talking to was about to plant his rice, and these are this is the seed rice he was about to plant. So here I've got a set of, I'll read them quickly and then I'll kind of pick out what I think is behind them. And I think they speak to this set of hang on to their land. Why don't they don't kind of move on, move out? No, I won't sell my land. It would turn out for the worse and my children would not have farmland to live on. Here we are farming families. We still need to have the land to farm on. Abandon any land or sell it is most foolish. Selling the land is like getting rid of opportunities to make a living. It's for your children and grandchildren's sustainability. Selling the land is such a ruin. And then a younger farmer. Land is everything in life. It's for your home, your food, where you can stand firm on your own ground. If there's no land, where can I stand? And then kind of similarly for Vietnam, because we have been peasants for so long, we do not know what to do other than farming. I grow rice to eat. Because we are farmers, we should farm. And I think in these quotes, we have kind of four things going on. I think there's a story of security and insecurity. And I'll come back to that when I come to livelihoods. That somehow, you know, the world may be a risky, unstable place, but if you have your land, then at least you can grow your rice, you can feed yourself and your family. So there's a kind of security story that I think is important. Secondly, I think there's an obligation story, that this is not my land. This is land that has been passed to me by my parents, and I need to pass it on to my children. So in a sense, you don't treat it like a commodity to be bought and sold according to its value. Yeah, you're entrusted with it for your lifetime, and then you pass it on. I think thirdly, there's a sense of a kind of innate cultural attachment to the land. That the land is not just a resource, not a capital in that classic kind of livelihoods approach, you know, one of a sort of form of natural capital. It's actually something that's imbued with a much deeper quality and value. And third, I mean, finally and fourthly, there's a sort of degree of inertia. I mean, particularly in the Vietnam, because we are farmers, we should farm. Yeah, well, sort of what else would I do other than farm? So I think there's a really interesting set of cultural factors that we need to pay attention to. So now I want to go on to the historical. I'll just check the time. Okay, we're doing all right. I do wonder whether there's a question of, we've just got to let time pass and then the farm size transition will take hold. And I say that on the basis of the farmers. So I've got here a table showing the average age of farmers from 37 years on average in Vietnam through to 70 years on average in Japan. But you can see even for Thailand, 51 years old. So what we have here is a story of the aging, or if you like, geriatrification of the farm labor force. Farmers are getting progressively older. And in some cases, I mean, in Japan, they're in the 70s. And what we see in Japan is the super aging farmers being replaced by aging farmers. So people retire from work and then they take on their parents' farm. And of course, there's lots of debate about what to do about the aging farm labor force as well. And you can see for Thailand, this is a photo I took in Mahasarakam in 2008. And as you can see, this is a transplant gang, and all of these workers are in their 60s and 70s. And that's not a picture I would have been able to take in 1982 or, you know, when I did my PhD. You know, this sort of work is a young person's work. It's not the sort of thing I could do in my 60s. So I am continually, I mean, I admire enormously this ability to go out into the sun and the heat and plant rice like this. And here are the figures for Thailand. And you can see that the number of farmers under 35 has gone from 62% to 31%, so it's halved. And the number over 45 has doubled from 23% to 52%. So we see there a really marked aging of the labor force. And I wonder whether at a sort of fundamental level, we'll only see the farm size transition take hold when these aging farmers, if you like, die, when they're no longer able to work. And maybe that's the point when we'll see this shift from farming as a way of life to a business, this shift from smallholders to larger units of production occur. And it's worth bearing in mind that the two graphs I showed earlier, and I've put them on this slide here, for the USA, I had the farm size transition stretched over 150 years. For Thailand, it's over 50 years. So maybe we just have to kind of be patient and wait, and then things will take hold. So the question for me, I mean, the interesting question is, will the children of these farmers return to the farm? Will that be possible? It's obviously happened in Japan, at least until now. So as I say, aging farmers replacing super aging farmers, but that's in a context of massive state support for agriculture. Yeah, is that something that other Asian countries can contemplate? So this is an open question for me as to what the historical story will be over time. And this is the last slide under there. This is just a study, again, we did in Konkan, and we've got here, this is divides the population up into farming and non-farming. And you can see that very clear generational, unsurprising, that generational difference between like the farming population, primarily in the age range 65 to 69, the kind of the mode, and then for non-farming in their 30s. So that sort of divide. And the question is, will those, if you like, individuals in the orange bars here, as they move up the age profile, will they become blue, so to speak? Yeah, will they take on those farming responsibilities and roles? Livelihoods. Okay, so I've got about maybe 15 minutes or so left. So I want to spend a bit more time on livelihoods and just sort of think about how livelihoods are constructed in the Asian context, and I'll draw mainly on Thailand to make this argument. This is again a photo I took in 1982, and when I look back at my field notes from 1982, farmers lived vulnerable and meager lives, I would say. I'm not sure if they were struggling to survive, but sort of survive was, I suppose survival was a challenge. I mean, they were working in, this is in the Northeast, in Mahasarakam, marginal rain-fed environment, planting glutinous wet rice in very capricious conditions. And the kind of question was, how do you get by? How do you ensure from one day to the next that you'll run to be able to feed your family? And I was doing that study in a period of relatively slow growth in Thailand. In 1982, there was the second oil price rise. I don't think anyone, well, certainly not me, I didn't see the Asian and the Thai economic miracle just across, you know, over the horizon. Yeah, I wasn't sufficiently prescient to be aware of that. To me, if you like, sort of Thailand was in a slow growth era, and rural poverty was pronounced and high. And I think most scholars and policymakers didn't really see a clear way out of that. We were sort of fiddling at the edges. And as I say, the miracle growth that would hit at the end of the 80s and that extraordinary transformation in Thailand's economic fortunes, I think very few people saw that coming. But of course, people, the farmers or the rural households that I was working with at that time, I mean, they did engage with non-farm work. They were moving to Bangkok during the dry season to earn some extra money. They, in some cases, were working in the Middle East. So there's people going to Saudi Arabia to work as Saudi Arabia benefited from the oil price rise. So there was, if you like, some movement in and out of the village, and that was supplementing rural livelihoods. And this is a graph that's taken from that work that I did in the early 80s. And it shows men on the left, women on the right, so male, female. It shows broad age ranges and farming and non-farming activities. And what you see in this graph is that 70, 80, 90% of people were farmers. Yeah, a relatively small minority were engaged in non-farm work, mainly in Bangkok, sometimes abroad. And of those, most of them were men and most of them were young. Yeah, so there was a kind of gendered and generational aspect to this sort of work. And they were doing the sort of thing that you can see here, loading rice sacks onto the back of sitlaws and that sort of thing. So fairly hard manual work in urban contexts. And I suppose if there was any expectation at that time, it was that maybe over time there would be a gradual formalization of work. And that can be seen in this graph here. So from 1980 through to 2000, you see an increase in the proportion of people who are formally employed. So this gradual formalization of work and economy as the Thai economy was, if you like, modernizing. And you saw impacts of this back in the village. So this is what used to be called Ban Sa'u, a Saudi house. I don't know if people use that expression any longer. Of course, no one goes to Saudi Arabia for work any longer, but certainly at the time, this was, I think I took this in 1987. And, these houses springing up across northeast Thailand in particular, colloquially termed Ban Sa'u, if you like, built on the back of income earned from working in Saudi Arabia and other countries abroad. So there were some ways in which livelihoods were constructed across space, but nonetheless, the smallholding was absolutely central to people's present and future. So everything was arrayed and organized around the smallholding, and in particular the rice smallholding. So now let's move forward to sort of 2008, so this arrow should be moved a little bit on, say 2008, 2009. And these data come from 2008. So same village, in fact, same interviewees. This is a panel study. So we re-interviewed the same households. And you can see two things in this graph. First of all, a sort of increasing feminization of work. So as many women working in the non-farm sector as men. And secondly, of course, the declining role of farming and agriculture in livelihoods. This is sometimes termed de-agrarianization. If we want to understand people's livelihoods by 2008, we really need to look beyond the farm, out of the village, out of the agricultural sector. If you like, the answer to why people are rich or poor, and if we're going to unpick the question of how people build a sustainable livelihood, we need to be much more agile intellectually in how we think about where livelihoods are built and made. But of course, I mean, another thing to say is that, and that's why I put this graph in here. What is interesting that from around about 2000 onwards, the decline in informal sector work and the growth of formal sector work appears to have stalled. And that's not because Thailand has stopped modernizing. That's because of the casualization of non-farm work. So men and women on 0-hour contract and so forth. So we have a kind of informalization of the formal economy, if you like, whereas before it was a formalization of the informal economy. So I think there's a really interesting shift in the way that work and formalization operate, again, not just in Thailand, but across the Asian context. And of course, occasionally this sort of, if you like, casualization of work occurs within the village. So some work that I've done with Ajahn Bopan at sort of Khon Kaen University, some extraordinarily poorly paid work in villages where people are making sort of finishing fishnets for a Taiwanese company and being paid around about 1/3 of the minimum wage. It's happening in the village, but it's for a global firm with a footprint that extends right across the Asian context. So I think there's something interesting here about how the vulnerability of the past, so what I thought was happening in 1982, and the precarity of the present, if you like, old poverty and new poverty, the way in which I understood poverty back in 1982 as rooted in trying to eke a living in marginal environmental conditions on small areas of life, and then the precarity of the present, where, if you like, the stories about why are people being paid so little for the work they do in the non-farm sector? How has that come to be? And that's a new type of poverty which is produced and reproduced in new ways. And I think one demands that we look back in time, so the inheritance of, if you like, meager living, and the other requires us to think about the way in which rural livelihoods are embedded in capitalist relations, and that's sort of produced in the present. And I think it's a, if you like, both are ways of thinking about poverty, but requires us to take very different lenses. Okay, my last point, and then I'll finish, was, well, my last theme, and then I'll sort of round it off, is a kind of methodological question, which is, so when I was doing my PhD work in Banondan Ta Songkhon in Mahasarakam, I didn't get out of the village really. I thought that all I had to do was to get into the village and I would understand everything, that all would become clear, and that, if you like, I could understand livelihoods in the village and poverty and wealth and prosperity and everything within the confines of this village that, you know, I call Banondan Ta Songkhon, and that everything would be, as I say, revealed. And I suppose over time I've come to realize that actually, and increasingly, that only offers us a very small part of the answer to the story. That if we're going to understand why do smallholders persist, we don't stand on the land in Banondan. We have to take a kind of step back and see how the land relates to the precarity of existence under conditions of late capitalism. And then suddenly you think, now I get it. Now I see why people won't sell their land. Because why would you sell it if life and livelihoods are so insecure outside, you know, in the wider world? And this quote from an economist is sort of, who does most of his work actually in Africa, kind of saying something similar, that methodologically we have to be attuned to that challenge. So here is an example of, if you like, a household that requires us to take this sort of view. So the blue shaded areas are the parts of the household that are in the village. And the rest, if you like, of this household, this extended household, that all, from a production point, from a functional point of view, they operate as a unit. It's all outside the village, it's outside farming, and yet it's part of the story. And of course, that sort of livelihood footprint is comparatively new. If I was going to draw one from my 1982 work, the shaded blue area would be much bigger. If you like, the story, 90% of the story would be contained within the village. Now I think it's, I don't know, 10 or 20% of the story. And that, from a methodological point of view, means that we have to do things slightly differently. So in this one, notionally, maybe we've got a farmer and a piece worker, like the lady I introduced before. We have also young men and women working elsewhere, but functionally remaining part of the household, remitting funds, maybe coming back during peak periods in the farm cycle to help out on the land and so on. Yeah, they're part of the story. And here we have, if you like, both these things going on, the informalization of the formal economy and the casualization of the formal economy. And both of those means that putting all of your, as we kind of say in English, all your eggs in one basket is a risk. And that's why you keep your land. So from a kind of methodological angle, and these are pictures from Vietnam. I mean, the one in the sort of bottom right is an abandoned homestead in Thanh Hoa in coast Vietnam. And this homestead's been abandoned, but the land hasn't been let go. You know, everyone's in Hanoi working, but they've lent the land to a relative to farm while they're absent. And the intention is to return at some point. So they're kind of keeping a foot in the village on the land, while at the same time maintaining another foot in Hanoi in the non-farm sector. And those two things intersect and complement each other. And my final slide, I've just written a paper which has the rather grand title, I think it's called Rethinking Livelihoods for the 21st Century, which I'm pleased to say last week was accepted for publication in World Development. And in this paper, we're arguing that actually the livelihoods framework needs to be restructured to take account of some of the changes that I've just outlined. And our, if you like, I mean, verticom's new sustainable livelihoods framework is the figure here in the bottom right, trying to pick up on some of the shortcomings as we see it in the traditional sustainable livelihoods framework. And there are kind of, I suppose in essence, what we're doing is trying to open it up in 4 ways. We're trying to open it up socially and geographically. So to understand the way that the household is not an individual by another name, but actually we need to understand what happens inside the household, and also to open up the village and to make sure that we don't see settlement and livelihoods intersecting. We also want to open it up from a temporal point of view and understand livelihood pathways rather than just livelihoods as a particular point in time. We're also trying to open it up relationally. So if you like, one person's wealth is based upon another person's relative poverty, and understanding how those two coincide is important. And finally, I suppose linking this to how we think about poverty and prosperity and futurity. So what happens down the line? Okay, I think that's it.